right, welcome everyone. Thank you so much for attending our March session of the SEG webinar series. I can't believe it's already March, but it is. Today, I'm really excited to introduce Amanda Livers Douglas, who is a principal geoscientist at the EERC. She analyzes the subsurface using geophysical methods and performs processing and advanced interpretation of geophysical data collected in the field. Amanda has over 5 years of experience managing geophysical projects from concept to survey design through field acquisition, data processing, and interpretation for several DOE-sponsored carbon capture and storage projects. She's led several geophysical field data acquisition efforts at the EERC and has deployed and been an operator for several large-scale seismic data acquisition surveys, including a semi-permanent autonomous seismic array deployed to monitor the migration of injected CO2 through the subsurface using the EERC's in-house data collection equipment. Amanda holds a master's degree in geology from the University of Kansas, Rock Chalk, and a bachelor's degree in physics from Concordia College in Minnesota. Her principal areas of interest and expertise include characterization and monitoring the subsurface by developing innovative processing methods and designing specialized data acquisition surveys. She's authored and co-authored several conference presentations, expanded abstracts, journal articles, and reports. So welcome, Amanda, and I will mute myself now so you can talk.
Well, thank you very much, Blair, and thank you guys very much for having me today. So as Blair said, I'm from the Energy and Environmental Research Center, or the EERC. We're a research center that's associated with the University of North Dakota, but we're a completely 100% grant-funded research center, and so most of our funding comes from competitive funding opportunities from federal, state sources, as well as commercial clients. One of our main research focuses at the EERC is carbon management. And so the EERC has been involved in the last 20-some years in several carbon capture, utilization, and storage projects across the US. And today I hope to share some of the work we've done in terms of geophysics applied to CCUS and how geophysics plays a role in the regulatory environment of carbon capture, utilization, and storage, as well as share some of our examples from some of the field studies we've done. Oh. Just a second here. Of course, there has to be some technical difficulties.
Happens to me every time also, no worries.
All right, so just briefly before I begin, I'd just like to acknowledge that most of the project data I'm sharing today was funded through projects with the Department of Energy. So as I mentioned, I'm going to talk about some of the general concepts around CCUS, talk about the current regulatory landscape for CCUS, and then go into more specifically the role of geophysics in addressing those regulations. And then I'm going to share some examples of field studies. So what is CCUS? So CCUS, in the context of how I'm using it here in this presentation, is capturing CO2 from anthropogenic sources. So you might have heard there is some other talk around CCUS focused on capturing CO2 from the atmosphere and ocean. One such notable discussion surrounding that is the Elon Musk funded X Prize. But today I'm mostly going to be focusing on capturing CO2 from anthropogenic sources. Carbon capture, utilization, and storage refers to capturing that CO2 and injecting it underground, either for use or for dedicated permanent storage. So there's two main types of CCUS. And one is the utilization, so injecting that CO2 for use in enhanced oil recovery. There's been some recent discussions on, how you can inject CO2 in conjunction with geothermal activities to generate geothermal energy. And with that, there's incidental storage. So while storage isn't the main goal of those methods, there is still incidental storage of CO2 through those processes. So the other type is dedicated storage. And so that's injection of CO2 into deep saline formations for permanent long-term storage. So there's lots of opportunity in the US for carbon capture, utilization, and storage. So the US has one of the largest storage capacities for CO2, given our vast amounts of sedimentary basins within the US. And so here I'm just showing those sedimentary basins and their proximity to large CO2 sources. So why hasn't the US made a big push for CCUS? It's been a global initiative to reduce greenhouse gas emissions, including CO2. So with this opportunity in the US, it hasn't taken hold yet, mostly due to money. There's been no economic incentives for it besides EOR purposes. So your small scale non-for-profit utility companies that operate your coal-fired power plants haven't had the resources to invest up to on the order of $1 billion to develop, construct, and operate these CCUS sites. And at the same order, small sources like ethanol companies to develop, construct, and operate a CCUS project at their sites, it could be upwards of a couple $100 million. So in the last several years, the US has been making strides to really incentivize and provide that economic incentives for carbon capture, utilization, and storage. The biggest step towards this was a bill referred to as 45Q that was passed in 2018. And so what this bill does is it provides tax credits for folks capturing CO2 from these anthropogenic CO2 sources and injecting it for permanent storage, or providing tax credits to qualified EOR projects. So in addition to 45Q, there's also the West Coast low carbon fuels market. And so what that is that's an incentive to pay a higher per ton rate for lower carbon intensive fuels, such as ethanol that has associated carbon capture and storage. And so for small ethanol companies, they can take advantage of both the 45Q tax credits and these LCFS benefits. Additionally, there's some local state incentives as well, such as no sales tax on capture facilities. So there are a lot of rules under 45Q and LCFS that you have to meet and qualify in order to qualify for the incentives. But additionally, the US has policy and regulatory related to underground injection control wells. And so CO2 injection wells fall into two categories. So for that EOR category, those are referred to as class 2 injection wells. And most states, you can see by the map, most states can issue those permits through the state itself. Now for CO2 injection wells for dedicated storage, so that's going to be if you're capturing CO2 directly from a coal-fired power plant and want to inject it in a well, right next door for permanent storage in a saline aquifer, that falls under class 6 wells. And so previously class 6 wells are regulated by the EPA. But in the last several years, 2 states, North Dakota and Wyoming, have received primacy. So now the state itself can issue those class 6 permits. So geoscience plays a large role in helping operators satisfy all these different rules, regulations, and requirements. So in addition to, be necessary for design and operation of these facilities, geoscience is used to help demonstrate that your operations are safe, the geology is suitable. And so to obtain permits and qualify for these incentives, you have to be able to show, the geology is suitable for storage. Injection is going to be safe. There's no hazards such as faults that could be activated. There's no other potential leakage pathways to underground sources of drinking water or USDWs, that the storage, if it's a dedicated storage site, that the storage is going to be permanent. And then you have to be able to account for it and monitor for it. So in addition to the dedicated storage projects, geoscience plays a large role for EOR type CCUS projects as well. So the class 2 regulations aren't as stringent in terms of monitoring and demonstrating that safe and permanent storage as the class 6 are. But geoscience is still very important when talking about CCUS projects at EOR facilities. So I'm going to talk a little bit more about the role of geophysics in carbon capture and storage. So here on this slide, you can see I've dropped out the U. So those people sort of use the term CCUS and CCS interchangeably. So CCS refers to just dedicated storage and not the utilization portion of it. But what I'm going to talk about has some application to both. Mostly I'm going to focus on the context of those class 6 regulations, as they tend to be more stringent than the class 2, as I mentioned. So geophysics plays a large role in developing your project and site assessment. Geophysics is one of the main tools for characterization. So when you're looking at assessing the storage capacity at a site, geophysics methods tend to be the most powerful tool to use for that, especially in areas where you don't have a lot of well control. And so what we're seeing in the state of North Dakota, the areas where we have our CO2 sources are in the regions of the basin outside of our oil and gas producing areas. So in these regions, we only have few sparsely spaced wildcat wells. And so you might only have 1 or 2 wells in your entire project area. And so coming in and doing geophysical surveys provides a lot more information to assess the site, as well as help satisfy those regulatory requirements. So in terms of class 6 requirements, you have to, in your class 6 permit, you have to demonstrate seal integrity. You have to demonstrate that there's no hazards or characterize any potential hazards there are. So in terms of looking at the reservoir, things that you need to discuss in your class 6 storage facility permits include, are there any stratigraphic or structural pinch outs? And so, this plays a context on the operation side into storage capacity, but also in terms of seals, is your primary seal laterally continuous, or does 1 mile away from your injection well, the seal pinches out? And so it's no longer it's no longer a safe and effective seal. So additionally, one thing that comes into play is additional confining zones. So the Low Carbon Fuel Standards program requires that you have an additional thief zone above your reservoir. And so what that is you have your reservoir or your primary injection horizon. You'll have your primary seal or confining zone. And then above that, they're looking for an additional porous and permeable layer referred to as the thief zone that will, in worst case scenario of a leakage, it provides you additional opportunity for monitoring and mitigation of that leak prior to any of those fluids reaching the USDW. And so one big thing also with site assessment is looking at any faults or other hazards, that might pose a risk to that long-term permanent storage. In addition to site assessment, a large part of the class 6 permit is developing a monitoring plan. And so with that, the class 6 permit requires indirect monitoring. So if you can't directly monitor your vertical and lateral plume on a regular basis, indirect monitoring is required approximately every 5 years. And so geophysics plays a large role in being those indirect monitoring methods. Geophysics also is a great way to verify your containment. You know, the CO2 is going where you think it is, there's no leaks, things like that, but also to account for your injected CO2. So with CO2 injection, in North Dakota, you have to pay pore space owners for the use of their pore space as you inject CO2 into it. And so using geophysics as a monitoring method is really important to make sure that you're showing the state that you're paying the right landowners for their pore space. So additionally is risk assessment. And so besides leakage, this may refer to any potential induced seismicity. And so the low carbon fuel standard program, they actually require downhole monitoring of seismic activity for events up to, or for events 2.7 or greater in magnitude. And so those are all important pieces of regulation that need to be met by these geophysics methods. So in terms of indirect monitoring methods, characterization, just briefly, I guess I'll comment on that. So in characterization, it seems to be the gold standard is still 2D and 3D seismic. So regulators seem to tend to consider those as satisfactory data sets to help satisfy these different storage facility regulations. And so the reason I say 2D as well as 3D is you might have a large scale carbon capture and storage site where you're injecting into multiple wells that are spread out by tens of square miles. And so it's not realistic to come in with, you know, a 200 square mile 3D seismic survey just to characterize that area prior to injection. And so a good way to, you know, still gain information about the subsurface and satisfy these regulations is to, you know, acquire a network of 2D lines or to use or purchase historical 2D data from the region. So, but indirect monitoring technologies, there's several methods that have been applied to CCUS projects. So here I list a bunch of methods that have been applied in the last 10 years or so at various CCUS sites around the US and the world. So this list isn't comprehensive, but I tried to highlight some of the most successful monitoring technologies that have been applied. So when it comes to developing a monitoring plan for either your CC or for either your EOR type project or your dedicated storage project, there's a lot of different considerations. So monitoring isn't a one size fits all. There's a lot of work that has to be done to formulate these plans. So, and things that should be considered are the objectives. You know, what specifically are you trying to monitor? Will the geophysical method you're applying be able to provide you answers to the things that you want to explore? Also, satisfying regulatory requirements. As I mentioned, the different regulatory bodies have, in some cases, specific requirements, you know, monitoring every 5 years or a downholes seismic monitoring of certain magnitude events and things like that. And so choosing methods that align with regulatory requirements is important. Also, impact to local landowners is one thing we've seen becoming a main sticking point when we're working with these small scale power plants and ethanol facilities. Most people in the region either work for those companies, they have family members that work for those companies, but keeping the landowners happy, you know, it is a big point of discussion here in North Dakota. So when we look at geophysical monitoring methods, we look at, you know, yes, we can do seismic every 5 years, but is there something we can do to disrupt, you know, planting and harvesting less than a repeat seismic survey. And so that might be, coming and acquiring seismic surveys in the dead of winter, looking at installing permanent arrays, or looking at different methods such as electromagnetic that might be less impactful to surface owners than seismic. Also, surface constraints is a big one with these coal-fired power plants that are looking to store CO2 right next to the plant. They all have settling ponds. There's lots of buildings and other surface infrastructure associated with those power plants. And so that's one thing to take into consideration when looking at your monitoring plans is, with a survey design, what are your limitations, and what's going to be the resolution of your data with those limitations. And then obviously, you need to choose a method that's compatible with your storage zone characteristics. You might not see a 40 seismic response in every reservoir, or due to the resistivity of your different intervals, you might not see a large contrast using EM methods. And then some other major ones are, finding cost-effective methods, adaptable methods, and then just that, those time constraints. So now I'm going to talk about some of the examples from the P-Core partnership region, where we've applied geophysics at several CCUS sites. So briefly, I wanted to talk about what is P-Core. So P-Core is the Plain CO2 Reduction Partnership. It's part of a DOE initiative called the Regional Carbon Sequestration Partnership. And so this has been going on since the early 2000s. And so the DOE has funded several phases of these partnerships. And so the extent of these partnership regions has changed over the years. It started out where there was smaller regions and more partnerships, and now in the current iteration is the fourth iteration of this initiative, and it's solely developed, or it's solely focused on accelerating commercial deployment. Earlier methods were looking at the feasibility and stuff like that, but now with these new time constraints with the the 45Q tax credits and things like that, the DOE is really looking at how can we push the commercial development of the projects throughout the U.S. So the EERC leads the P-Core partnership, which is shown on this map here in green, which includes 4 Canadian provinces and in about 10 states. And so what the P-Core partnership is, it's a partnership of over 100 companies, including national labs, research centers, universities, state governing agencies, oil and gas companies, service companies, utility companies, technology companies. So it's a wide array of folks who are interested in benefiting from learning how to accelerate and commercialize CCUS and really start getting some of those CCUS projects throughout the region up and running. So since the early 2000s, the P-Core partnership has conducted several studies throughout the region. So on the map here in blue, I'm showing all of the projects that were conducted under the P-Core partnership. And then in orange are all the projects the EERC has been involved in related to CCUS that have really stemmed from those relationships made under the P-Core partnership. And so just a note here, about 50 or 60% of the projects shown on the map have some sort of geophysics component to them. And so now I'm going to walk through some of those geophysics data examples. And so the first set of examples I'm going to be showing are all studies that were conducted in the Bell Creek oil field. And so the Bell Creek oil field is located in southeastern Montana in the Powder River Basin. So the Bell Creek oil field is an active EOR field that's operated by Denbury Resources. The Bell Creek oil field was first discovered in the late 1960s, And since then, it's a conventional field, and since then it's undergone primary and secondary recovery efforts. In 2013, Denbury started CO2 injection as part of tertiary recovery efforts. And so a lot of the geophysics studies that I'll be discussing have been done during this tertiary recovery phase. So the reservoir at the Bell Creek oil field is the muddy sandstone, which is about a depth of 4,500 feet. And so this is only a 30-foot thick sandstone. So when we talk about geophysical monitoring methods, thinking about resolution of different methods and the fact that this is a 30-foot thick sand is going to be very interesting to keep in mind as I show you the various data sets. So at the Bell Creek oil field, there's been an extensive geophysical campaign done, either by Denbury as part of their regular EOR operations, or through DOE-funded research projects that Denbury's been a partner on. So the EERC has done several studies as part of PCOR and also standalone research projects. So I'm going to touch on some of those here, but not all of them. And additionally, another note, there has been a CSEM study done as well by the Colorado School of Mines. That was another DOE-funded project done at Bell Creek. So on the left map, I'm showing a satellite image of the Bell Creek oil field, or a topographic image. And so the colorful outlines are actually development phases. So Bell Creek was developed in a staged approach where they started CO2 injection in one phase at a time. So in 2012, a 40 square mile baseline seismic survey was acquired at Bell Creek. And then in 2014, a repeat seismic survey was done over the area that had been undergoing active CO2 injection, which I'm showing here in blue. And so just a note, prior to the repeat survey being done, a 2D time-lapse study was done just to test the feasibility of using time-lapse seismic at Bell Creek. So as I mentioned, it was a 30-foot thick reservoir, and so fluid substitution modeling had been done. It showed there would be change in the seismic response due to CO2 saturation changes in the reservoir, but those changes would be minor. So a 2D time-lapse test line was done prior to the survey, and it did confirm that they would see a time-lapse seismic response. So as I mentioned before, seismic was deployed as one of the main characterization methods. And so here I'm just showing, this is a clipped version of the baseline survey. So I'm showing amplitude data. And so you can see all the red triangles and the green dots are all the wells in the field. And there's a lot of wells, so there's a lot of well control. And in the seismic, you can start to make out some channel and like bar type complexes. And so with the well control and the seismic, folks were able to model or come up with a depositional model for the muddy formation at this location. But what we found is once we did the repeat monitor survey, we learned a lot more about the depositional environment and the reservoir heterogeneity that we could glean just from the original 3D survey. So here on the right, I'm showing a 40 difference amplitude map where this is amplitude data generated subtracting the baseline survey from the monitor survey. And so all the areas with high or red amplitudes here on the right map, those are areas where we see a change in seismic response in the reservoir. And so you can see that most of this change is centered around those red triangles, which are active injection wells, indicating that we are seeing a time-lapse change due to the injection of CO2 and the change of CO2 saturation in the reservoir. And so with this, we are able to expand characterization of the site we're able to now clearly see permeability barriers, fluid communication pathways cutting across those permeability barriers, and things like that. And so, not only was 3D seismic a good method for site characterization, but this 4D also expanded our knowledge of the reservoir. And so how 4D seismic was beneficial to this EOR project is allowed us to build better geologic models of the subsurface, which were used to simulate the reservoir, which provided improved confidence in managing the operations, visualizing sweep efficiency, things like that. So with that time-lapse change, as I mentioned, we're looking at the difference between the monitor data and the baseline data. And so that change in this data set is a change in amplitude centered around the reservoir. So going back to our 4D difference map, as I mentioned, a lot of the change we see in the reservoir is centered around those CO2 injection wells. But if you look to the southwest portion of the survey, you see that we have a lot of time-lapse change surrounding water injection wells. And so we know from this data that we're not only seeing change due to CO2 saturation, but we're also seeing a time-lapse seismic change due to a pressure change within the reservoir as well. So one interesting thing to note is phase 1 on the left here was separated by this permeability barrier from phase 2 on the right. And in terms of using CO2 to quantify the amounts, or in terms of using 4D seismic to quantify the amounts of CO2 injected into the reservoir, this is a good example of the limitations for that. And so in phase 1 has about 80% more CO2 injected than phase 2 in this time frame of this time-lapse seismic. But you can see in phase 2, we have more of a time-lapse seismic response in the reservoir. And so this, is giving us an indication that change in the reservoir doesn't, directly correlate to change in CO2 saturation, given this effect of pressure. So we did another project looking at, can we separate pressure and saturation? And so why this is important, not only for EOR projects, but also for dedicated storage projects. If you're seeing a pressure change and you're required to pay landowners a percentage of injected CO2 for use of their pore space, if you're imaging the pressure plume with seismic in addition to the CO2 plume, then you could be paying more to landowners for those dedicated storage projects. And so being able to separate the pressure effect from saturation, has benefits not only for EOR projects for understanding sweep efficiency, but also for dedicated storage projects in terms of, operations and conformance with your permit. So we ran a study in partnership with Delft Inversion, where we looked at simultaneous full waveform joint inversion of both the 2012 baseline and the monitor survey. And results showed promising that with this new inversion technique, you can start pulling out some of those contributions of pressure and differentiating it from saturation. So I've talked a little bit about 3D and 4D seismic data, and those tend to be the industry standard. But as I mentioned before, for dedicated storage sites where you might have multiple wells spaced out over hundreds of square miles, that 3D or 4D seismic might not always be applicable, but also at small sites too, to reduce the impact to local landowners. An option might be to look at a sparse data acquisition as opposed to conventional seismic. So on the left here, I'm In the orange and gray dots, I'm showing the source and receiver points for a conventional seismic survey done at the Bell Creek oil field. And at the right, I'm showing an example of a survey we did using a sparse array where we have one stationary source and one sparsely spaced set of receivers. So this is over the same area, and so you can see it, the density of equipment being laid out, potential for people to be walking over that land and driving and things like that. And so this sparse array technology that's been deployed at the Bell Creek field is called the Scalable Automated Semi-Permanent Seismic Array. And so the concept behind this method is, can you use a sparse array with a stationary fixed source and a set of sparsely spaced sensors to monitor the reservoir? And so the idea behind this is you'd be monitoring discrete locations in the reservoir, and you could do it remotely on a weekly basis, as opposed to with a 3D repeat survey, which might only be done every 5 years. So in the context of EOR, looking at sweep efficiency and stuff like that, you can get more real-time actionable data from a technology like this. And so what this is it's a receiver-based method where you're looking at the time-lapse change from one sensor and the monitoring point in the reservoir associated with that sensor. So we refer to it as a fence line monitoring approach. It's not going to give you a perfect outline of your CO2 plume or tell you all the specific details about how the plume is migrating, but it will, like a green light, red light system, it has the potential to tell you when CO2 has passed a specific monitoring point. So here again is just a map showing a different deployment of this array, where your yellow diamonds are your receiver locations, and your purple squares are your source locations. And so using just single sensor data, you're able to take or shoot every week multiple shots. And so every week you have essentially receiver gathers where you have multiple data points from a monitor point within the reservoir from each sensor. And so this allows you to apply receiver gather processing to each data set, apply stacking, which is very beneficial for reducing signal to noise, and essentially produce a single trace, which represents the monitor data from that week. And so to look at each reservoir and the monitor point associated, or each receiver, and look at the monitor point associated with each receiver, you're essentially doing it on, that trace by trace basis, representing 1 week of data. So here, the map I'm showing reservoir simulation results for this phase of data. The black dots represent the calculated midpoints for each receiver, which ideally represent that monitoring point in the reservoir that's being monitored with each individual receiver. And then on the right, I'm showing a panel of monitor data where each trace in that data set represents a different week. Then I'm showing the baseline data, which is essentially one trace repeated. And then on the right is the cross equalized difference, where you can start to see time-lapse change in the reservoir, once CO2 has passed. And so this method is still being refined. It's gone through 2 iterations. So on the left, I'm showing data from, the SASA 1 iteration where we used a weight drop source. SASA 2, we deployed stronger sources that allowed more data collection through the use of orbital vibrators. And so you can see, we're making large gains with improving the acquisition and signal to noise of this data set, pushing it closer to commercialization and applicability for monitoring at these CCUS projects. And so there, just a picture, I'm showing the orbital vibrator and one of the autonomous nodes that's used as the sensor for this method. So additional note about deploying seismic sensors. So this isn't at the Bell Creek site, but I wanted to bring this up because this is a really neat array. So Aquastore is a dedicated carbon capture and storage site just north of the border near Edmonton, Saskatchewan. And so it's operated by the Petroleum Research Council. And so this is not an EERC-led project, but they are in the PCOR region and they're part of the PCOR partnership. So I wanted to share how cool their data is. So they have a 2.5 by 2.5 kilometer permanent buried seismic array. And they've done several repeat surveys. So with this survey, it has about 600 receivers, and it sort of is that sparser acquisition. And so with this, noise is a factor. You know, those sparse acquisitions using conventional 3D, you do expect more impact from noise. But one neat thing they show is that the noise doesn't impact much their 4D response. And so they do see a change in the reservoir with each repeat monitor survey. And another cool thing I just wanted to point out about this is, you know, they're injecting into multiple horizons, and their 4D data, even with a sparse acquisition, shows that they can resolve the time-lapse difference in those different horizons. And so while sparse acquisitions do have merit, you have to take into consideration your expected size of your CO2 plume. You know, this would work great for a small ethanol company for dedicated storage, but it might be too expensive to, you know, have a buried seismic array at one of these large scale projects where you have wells spaced over large areas. So, and just quickly, there are other geophysical methods out there that do have some promise in terms of indirect monitoring. So briefly, just to mention, you know, that an INSAR survey was done at the Bell Creek field. Here I'm just showing on the left the area of investigation for these survey time-lapse INSAR surveys, and on the right, I'm showing a map showing surface deformation. And so just a note, we're only seeing surface deformation in phase 4, and that's because this baseline survey was done after injection had started in phases 1, 2, and 3. And so we were able to correlate this deformation with CO2 injection and invert this data to come up with a pressure difference in the reservoir. And so on the top right, I'm showing this pressure difference, and on the bottom right, I'm showing the actual 4D difference amplitude map. And so it does have some correlation to a pressure increase due to CO2 injection. And so this is just another method that could help in the future potentially separate out those CO2 saturation and pressure effects in the reservoir. And then, so lastly, I'm just going to touch briefly on electrical methods. So electrical methods, when you're talking about just being able to monitor and visualize CO2 saturation, you know, they have a lot of benefits compared to seismic. With electrical methods, some things to consider are the acquisition and the resolution in the area that can be imaged. So here I'm showing a borehole to surface electromagnetic survey that we did. And this is a great method that shows promise to look at CO2 saturation changes in the reservoir. But using a borehole as your source, it does limit your ability to monitor a sufficient distance laterally from the well. Another method, controlled source electromagnetics. So similar using the EM method, but using a surface transmitter. You know, this allows you more opportunity to image larger areas. And so just a quick note, the EERC is partnering with KMS Technologies to test their acquisition system currently at a CCS site. So that's pretty exciting. And we also have 3D survey there. So we're looking forward to comparing the effectiveness of each method and the feasibility of it for long-term storage. And then there's some more experimental methods out there, such as seismoelectric method. So this method is sensitive to different types of fluids within the reservoir. And so the neat thing about this is you're imaging locations right below your source essentially. And so you don't have this large array footprint. And similar to SASA, it can be this fence line monitoring, has CO2 past this point or has it not? But one thing to consider is depth of investigation and resolution with this method. So just to summarize, CCUS is an important emission reduction technology to meet, the global initiative of reducing emissions. It's one of the next best steps to explore. And the US has made great strides to provide incentives for companies to do this and it to be an economically viable method. Geophysics plays a large role in CCUS on all aspects from project development, operating, monitoring to satisfying all the regulatory requirements. You need to recognize and understand the benefits and limitations of geophysics methods, which ones might be best suited for your project. And long-term monitoring isn't one size fits all, and it needs to be adaptive. You might propose 4D seismic and then 10 years down the line, if that doesn't turn out to be cost effective or isn't an efficient way to monitor, you need to build an adaptability on your monitoring plans that allow you to, change those with new developing, changing technologies. And developing cost-effective, low-impact monitoring methods is essential. I don't think we have the answer yet. We have a lot of good answers, but we don't have the answer. So there's a large market for continuing to develop and expand on monitoring technologies. So I'd like to thank the other sponsors of this research briefly as well, and then ask for any questions.
Thank you, Amanda. That was awesome. A fascinating talk. There are many, many questions in our Q&A, so I hope you're prepared.
Sure.
So first, David asks, do regulatory agencies require you to establish the reliability of monitoring technology? And if so, how do you go about doing that?
Good question. So I realistically, they couldn't, just because, like I said, it's not a one size fits all. And the discussions we've had with North Dakota regulators with respect to Class 6 permits and monitoring is that each site, has to have some flexibility in the methods it can deploy, but also the state has built in clauses where every so many years you reevaluate your monitoring plan. And so your monitoring plan doesn't have to be set in stone when you apply for your permit. They have those avenues to change it, modify it, and update it, which was very smart on their end, because you could go into it thinking something's going to work, and then the industry turns upside down and that technology proposed might no longer be available in 5 or 10 years. So the regulators have been very smart, and they've left those doors open for those types of modifications.
Okay, just going down the list here. So speaking about cost-effective methods for monitoring, can gravimetry be helpful?
Yeah, so that's one of the things I left off of the other list of monitoring methods that have been applied. So time-lapse gravity surveys have been applied and studied for CCUS projects before. And so what it really comes down to when choosing monitoring methods, you need to satisfy the regulatory requirements. You might also have some financial restrictions on the side of the operator. But then on the technical side, will that method answer the questions I want? As geophysicists, we want to deploy every single method on a site, but it might not always be realistic. And so I think given resolution, that's why gravity, might typically be left off the list in favor of 4D seismic. But gravity is still getting attention and still being considered a viable method, depending on what your objectives for monitoring are.
All right. how is the current job market for geophysicists in CCUS? Do you see that changing in the next 5 years or so for those looking to maybe pivot out of oil and gas?
Sure, and that's a big topic of discussion right now. And CCUS, there have been some oil and gas operators that have had divisions focused on carbon storage. And so we do see oil and gas operators, pulling from their resources internally from geologists and geophysicists. But there is opportunity for smaller consulting companies to, start collaborating with these site operators, such as the ethanol companies, who may not be partnering with these large scale oil and gas companies for the operation side. So there is a market for it. I don't know what that looks like. So right now with the recent passage of 45Q, I think all of these small companies are starting to ramp up to what does a carbon capture and storage project look like at my site. And then I think in the next, 5 to 10 years, we're going to start seeing that play out more of, okay, what type of technical folks do they need to start having in-house on the operating side, or what type of consulting companies are they hiring? So.
All right. Couple questions on challenges presented in the seismic data that you used, whether that's processing or maybe some shear wave interference or anything like that. Can you comment a little bit on that?
Sure. I'm guessing that's related to maybe the SASA data. So that sparse array data that we're looking at common receiver gathers, processing and developing better processing algorithms is certainly a big part of that. We're not able to apply conventional noise attenuation routines that rely on shot gathers or CDPs and stuff like that. So that's one limitation with that method, but certainly being able to separate out the different energy or seismic energy arrivals and differentiate those P wave reflections from guided waves, direct arrivals, or shear waves is a challenge. So.
Okay. And then there's a couple of questions on fluid phase. When you're separating the fluid effects from pressure effects, did the phase change and of the CO2? And then are the elastic properties of CO2 known well enough that those fluid substitutions can be pretty accurate?
Sure. So, given what we have in the seismic method, I think, we do have some changes in the CO2 phase. So it's injected as supercritical CO2, but we do have some mixing of the CO2 and oil in the miscible zone and stuff like that. I don't know if we have great enough resolution to start separating out those different phases, but I guess in combination with some of the seismic work, there's a big push to include more core data where you're doing dynamic injection tests and gathering that additional P and shear wave data from the core over those different pressure, temperature, and saturation conditions. And so I think that will help. But it's not something that we can, I guess, answer with the seismic alone.
Okay, and then I guess along those same lines is, how have any of the wells been relogged to calibrate those fluid responses?
Yeah, great question. So at the Bell Creek oil field, there's been a huge pulse neutron log campaign where we've, over multiple phases, we have in some cases 3 to 4 repeat P&L logs to look at the different saturations. In some cases, those align with the repeat seismic, which is nice. In other cases, because there's such a long duration between the repeat seismic, we don't align those quite well. At the Aquastore site, they have time-lapse or repeat P&Ls that correspond to exact baseline and monitor surveys. And so that's been really neat with that project, to use that data hand in hand to look at those saturation changes in their monitor well from the P&L with the saturation changes in the seismic data. So.
Sarah asks, do you use any kind of machine learning for continuous monitoring right now? Or do you see that being used?
So not in any of the studies that I've discussed here today. The Department of Energy has a huge machine learning initiative that they're pushing right now. So it's becoming an increasingly relevant topic. But certainly, as we look at the commercialization of these projects and these ethanol plants that have to do that long-term passive monitoring of induced seismicity, we're going to have to start applying those machine learning algorithms, because it's not going to be economically feasible to hire a geophysicist to go through all that data for, you know, the 20 years of injection and maybe 10 years of post-closure after injection, where you have to monitor the site. So that's a really good question, but yeah, I think machine learning is going to play a large role on the operations side of monitoring as these projects get up and running.
Okay. Do you know of any CCUS projects in the marine environment, like in the Gulf of Mexico, or is it just primarily an on-land situation?
Good question. So the EERC isn't involved in any, but some of the other regional partnerships funded by the DOE are looking at offshore projects. The DOE has also, in the last several years, funded some studies primarily looking at offshore injection. And then, of course, in other countries, there is offshore injection as well. So it's not just land-based, but the P-Corps partnership is primarily looking at injection on land. So.
Okay, fair enough. And I think we just got time for one more question. There was mention earlier of VSP data. Has VSP data been collected for all the projects that you're involved in, or anything specifically that you know of?
Yeah, great question. So I've been involved in at least 2 projects that they've acquired VSP data on, and I know it's planned for some of the dedicated carbon capture and storage projects that are currently being permitted. It is a great method. People are looking at using fiber optics to acquire VSPs as well, which, if you're using fiber optics for your downhole pressure and temperature monitoring requirements, it can save money in the long term. Some of the limitations with that being, you know, how far away from the wellbore can you monitor? And so at sites where you already have a fiber installed, it's a great method to apply the first couple of years that you start injecting, so you get quick answers right away. And then when your plume grows too big, that's when you can switch over to those larger scale monitor surveys. But VSPs are a relevant method that are being explored.
Okay, great. And I guess one more quick question, hopefully. Are the Bell Creek data, especially seismic, publicly available?
Good question. So because the data was acquired as part of the commercial EOR operations, not all the data is publicly available. Because this project was funded under the DOE, some data sets like the SASA seismic data set are publicly available through what's called the EDX data exchange. The DOE has a data exchange website where you can log in and explore CCUS project reports, see what seismic data might be publicly available and stuff like that. And so while the conventional 3D and 4D data might not be available, there are still data sets out there that may be.
Okay, great. Thank you again, Amanda. I think we're about out of time, but there are many other questions, so I'm not sure how we'll redirect those. If you have any thoughts on that, Blair or Shelley, let me know. But I also want to remind everybody about our next SEG Women's Network webinar in April on the 28th at 9 a.m. A little bit different time change on water distribution and partitioning in carbonate rocks. So that should be another interesting one. Blair, did you have an idea about questions?
Would it be okay if individuals send you an email with any follow-up questions, Amanda?
Yep, certainly.
Can you
So
email? Oh, there we go.
Yep. My
Perfect.
email address is alivers@undeerc.org. So feel free to email me. I'm also on LinkedIn if you don't remember my email, so you can always send me a message on there as well.
Amanda, this was a fantastic presentation. Thank you so much. I learned a lot today, actually, so I really appreciate it.
Yeah, thank you very much for the opportunity.
All right.